Hi, Bruce. Should I get started?
I'm waiting for a minute for the people to join.
Oh, okay, good. Okay, I'll stand by. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Well, thank you for joining us on day 2 of our Digital Innovation Summit. Today, we have 3 sessions, and so this is the first session. The first session is going to be on the evolving ransomware threat. We are honored to have Tom Corcoran and to join us as our guest speaker. Now, Tom has very relevant background in this area. He started out as an intelligence officer and in crisis management at the United States Department of Defense. Then he was the senior policy advisor at the United States Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. And then he switched over to the House and as the senior policy advisor for the U.S. House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. He himself is a U.S. Navy Reserve Intelligence Officer, and he also was previously the global head of cyber threat intelligence and at Zurich Insurance Group, and he's currently the head of cybersecurity at Farmer Insurance. And so, Tom, thanks for your service to the country, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks for that very generous introduction. Let me share some slides here. You all see that?
Yes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so thanks for that introduction, Bruce. And I'm obligated to start with a quick disclaimer that the views I express today are my own, do not necessarily reflect those of my current or past employers. I'd also like to start today with a personal story about ransomware. And I would encourage you all to share your own in the chat. I'd be surprised if several of you have not sat in a gas line somewhere in the U.S. or suffered other terrible inconveniences because of this scourge of ransomware. My personal story is it did actually did not impact me personally, but it impacted a very good friend of mine, Dave. He was getting some back surgery at a MedStar hospital. If you're not familiar with it, MedStar is a hospital network in DC and Maryland in the US. And Dave was getting some scheduled back surgery. And when he woke up from his anesthesia, which is already sort of an unpleasant, groggy experience, he was surrounded by a crowd of nervous doctors and nurses who were clustered around his wife with a clipboard, asking her questions about his medical allergies and some other important medical history. And the reason they were doing that was because MedStar had been hit by a ransomware attack and had shut down all of their medical record systems and logistic systems. And so Dave came out fine. The surgery worked great, and he didn't have any issues. But you can see how that could have gone bad. Hospitals have great systems for looking for conflicts in drug interactions, especially folks taking multiple medications. Sometimes they can have tragic interactions when mixed together. And so without these systems, without Dave's medical history and his chart, these doctors were at a severe disadvantage. And so it ended well for Dave, but you can see in the press yourself that there were some terrible outcomes from that, not just MedStar, but other ransomware attacks that hit other hospitals. So this is an example of a ransomware note. And if you're not familiar with it, what ransomware is a malicious actor, a cyber criminal uses a vulnerability in a system or a network to get in and encrypt the data on that system. And there are very small scale attacks that go after just your personal laptop, but the attacks that are dominating the headlines today are the what they call big game ransomware or enterprise scale ransomware, and where in these cases, these threat actors get access to a company or an institution's network and encrypt some or all of their data and systems. I'm sure most of you saw the recent attack on the Colonial Pipeline or the JBS meat company, and so they get in there and they encrypt all the systems and then demand a ransom in order to release that data and return those systems to functionality. So in this case, this is the SamSam group node, and this is the group that attacked the MedStar hospitals. They also attacked the Atlanta city government and some other notable victims in the healthcare industry. And the idea is to instill fear in their victims to get them to pay the ransom. And so in most cases, I think that's enough. Just getting your data back is enough to motivate folks to pay the ransom. But we'll talk a little bit later about how they're also amping up the fear with other scare tactics to get there. The primary payment for ransomware is typically some kind of e-currency like Bitcoin or Ethereum. So just a bit of history for ransomware, and I would begin with a caveat that there aren't good data sets that can give you a clear picture of what's happening and where the trend lines are going. But the data that is available publicly is suggestive. And the reason there isn't good data is because victims feel shame or fear legal or regulatory implications for revealing what happened. And so they don't talk publicly necessarily about what happened. In the case of JBS or the Colonial Pipeline or MedStar, they don't have a choice but to talk about it because the impacts of the ransomware are seen by their customers and patients. So I did a bit of research trying to find the first ransomware attack, and the earliest one I could see was a very limited and not quite effective attack back in 1989. And I can't say confidently that was the first time anybody had the idea of using encryption to extract their ransom, but that was the first one I could find. But attacks increased significantly and started impacting enterprises more often in 2012. And I think you can safely say that that trend was fed by the popularity of e-currency, and that made it a lot easier for ransomware threat actors to play this game. Prior to the emergence of Bitcoin, it was a lot harder to extract a payment and get it without basically getting caught by a law enforcement agency. A couple of interesting policy notes that I think are important to the story are a guidance that was put out by the U.S. Department of Treasury in 2020, advising U.S. entities that it's illegal to make a payment to a designated entity. And when I say designated entity, that's a terrorist group or other organized crime groups that the Department of Treasury has designated. And it's illegal to make payments to those groups. And that's a very complicating factor for victims of ransomware, because oftentimes groups like SamSam have been designated, and therefore it's illegal to make payments to them. There's a great question about how vigorously the Department of Justice or Treasury will enforce these actions, but they're letting companies know that it's not legal to make these payments to these designated entities. Probably more importantly, in April 2021, the U.S. Department of Justice launched a ransomware task force. And this was a very positive development in my view, that we're now seeing the U.S. government using all the tools in its toolbox to go after these groups, which are having such a huge impact on our economy, and even going after our critical infrastructure, like our pipelines and our hospitals. The U.S. also announced on June 7th that they had actually recovered the Bitcoin that had been paid by the Colonial Pipeline company to get their data back. And I would say this is also a very encouraging sign that the tide may be turning, at least in a limited way, against these groups and to help U.S. companies. I think, in an academic forum like this, I think it's important to talk about the economics behind these trends. Why is this happening? Why are we seeing this explosion in ransomware attacks? cybercrime, cyber attacks are certainly not new. They've been around since we first started using computers. But the economics have driven much more sophisticated and much deeper networks of cyber crime and cyber criminals. I think a good analog or a historical example to compare ransomware to is credit card fraud. Several years ago, the majority of the cybercrime we were seeing and the revenues that were going to malicious actors was the result of credit card fraud. They were attacking U.S. companies to breach their credit card databases to get their customers' credit card information. They were breaching point-of-sale systems like Target to get those credit card data. The credit card industry reacted. They went with chip and pin in some cases to defeat these attacks. They've done other things to defeat that crime. Just as importantly, the U.S. government and the private sector went after the networks that were perpetrating this credit card fraud. It was, from my perspective, it was really fun to watch back when I was in government, the way the private sector pitched in to basically take these networks down. They were basically infiltrating the forums that these cyber criminals used to basically trade services because it was a pretty diverse market. There were the folks that would actually do the breaches and get the data. There were the folks that would actually monetize that data by selling the credit cards to certain people who would then go out, for example, to go to Target or Best Buy and buy some expensive items with that credit card before it was canceled. And a lot of money was changing hands, and there was a lot of specialized skills in that network. And so the private sector and the U.S. government went after the top tier of that ecosphere. And so and some of these folks, couldn't help but spend the money and travel a bit. And so even if they were in a place like Russia or another area that was not cooperating with U.S. law enforcement, they would travel. And my favorite case was Carter, whose name I forget at the moment. But the private sector researchers determined who the woman he was dating, and she basically posted on social media that they were going to Amsterdam for a vacation. And the last post I saw on that private sector blog was, does anybody have a contact at the Secret Service? And then there was a headline maybe about 3 or 4 days later of this guy being arrested on arrival in Amsterdam. And so over time, it became much harder for credit card fraudsters to move that data and monetize it and make anything from it. And also the top of the ecosphere were basically being attrited by arrests and other law enforcement action. And so you saw credit card fraud tail off. But as that was tailing off, the economics changed, and several sophisticated cyber criminals had the bright idea of selling your data back to you. And so oftentimes, if a malicious actor breaches a network, there's sensitive data in there, but there's not much they can do with it. Nobody, say for example, your health data on a hospital network, you would be embarrassed if that data was released, but there's not necessarily a criminal market out there to buy that data. And so they had the bright idea of that data may not be valuable to anybody else, but it's valuable to you and your doctors. And they encrypt it and sell it back to you. And that was the, I hate to use the word, but the economic innovation that basically drove this trend in cybercrime. Another important economic overlay over this, and maybe not economic, more political, is nation-state motives. The cyber criminals can't conduct ransomware campaigns for very long in a European or U.S. country because we're going to find them and they're going to get arrested. So you'll see that most of the most active cyber criminals are in North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And I would say the most prolific and most dangerous ransomware crews are in Russia. And what's interesting about these cyber criminals is they're very careful not to attack any Russian targets. And so the question then begs itself, is the Russian government encouraging this activity, or are they just turning a blind eye to it? And the Russian government has a long history of engaging in activity to destabilize U.S. and Western economies and political systems. to include interfering in our elections. And so it's not hard to imagine that they are enjoying the disruption that these ransomware crews are causing, particularly when they go after critical infrastructure like our pipelines and our hospitals. Similarly, the Iranians and North Koreans also have a motive to disrupt U.S. and Western economies, but they also need the revenue. It's not quite as dire for the Russian government, but the Iranian and North Korean governments are quite isolated, and their economies need the revenue. And so you can imagine that they would be encouraging, if not taking a piece of the revenue coming from these ransomware operations that are being launched out of their countries. And this brings us back to the U.S. Department of Justice task force and other U.S. government activities that are going on. The private sector doesn't have much recourse when it comes to pushing back on these ransomware attacks coming out of these denied areas in Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Certainly, they can help track the threat actors when they travel and pass that information to the U.S. government or Western law enforcement to encourage arrests of these folks when they are traveling outside of their countries. But beyond that, there's not much we can do. We can file civil lawsuits against these countries and maybe seize their assets, but there's not much to go after when it comes to a country like Iran or North Korea. And so that's where the U.S. government comes in, and that's where this Department of Justice task force comes in, where they have more tools and more ability to apply pressure on those governments, and also to do things like hack back and steal back the ransomware that was paid to the colonial ransomware attackers. So the next sort of big policy question here is to pay or not to pay. Another good analog to this sort of scourge we're experiencing now is a lot of the kidnappings that happened of U.S. and Western citizens in South America back in the 80s and 90s. And so the dilemma that a family faced if your husband or your wife was an oil worker in Colombia back in those days, and they're kidnapped, and you get basically a message that your husband is or your spouse or your loved one is being held hostage in the jungles of Colombia. What do you do? Because the FBI will probably tell you that if you pay, you're perpetrating this problem. That the attackers, the kidnappers are kidnapping people because they want the money, and they know that people will pay or try to pay if this happens. And so that was often a dilemma for U.S. law enforcement when they were advising families about these kidnapping. By law, they couldn't encourage or facilitate those ransom payments. But at the same time, they couldn't help but be sympathetic. It's this person's son, daughter, husband, and there's a decent chance they might be killed if the ransom wasn't paid. And so we're stuck with the same economic dilemma for cyber ransomware. If a company like Colonial or JBS or any other modern American company, their data is their business, and without their data, they're dead in the water. And so if they don't have the ability to recover that data, they have no recourse if they want to stay alive as a business, but to pay the ransom to get that data back. The moral dilemma there is that you're basically feeding and encouraging these ransomware attacks because these folks know they'll be paid if they are able to successfully encrypt your data. The Treasury Department guidance saying that it's illegal to pay make a payment to a designated entity doesn't really help you as a company because you're stuck with this dilemma of, okay, if I don't pay this ransom, I'm out of business. My customers will walk away. My corporate reputation will be gone. I can't deliver on my contracts. If I do pay the ransom and I get hit with Treasury sanctions, that's a small price to pay on top of the ransom relative to going out of business. And so that's, I think, where a lot of companies are today, struggling with this issue. I was encouraged to see that the Department of Justice didn't go after Colonial for paying the ransom. They went after the attackers and stole the Bitcoin back. And I hope to see a lot more of that in the near future. There isn't great data, as I said earlier, about how many attacks are going on. They certainly appear to be going up based on the observations we can make from the press. The FBI Cybercrime Center estimates that there were $29 million in losses from ransomware in 2020. But I suspect that's a pretty low number based on the fact that I think there were a lot more ransomwares paid that were just not publicly discussed or declared to the FBI in 2020. Another bit of data which I think is suggestive but probably not a complete description of what happened is that the cybersecurity company Sophos did a survey of their customers, and they estimate that 26% of ransomware victims that responded to the survey got their data back by paying the ransom. And so, that's just Sophos customers and other people that responded to the survey. And so, again, not a scientific survey, but a suggestive data point. But what I also found interesting in there, and also tragic, is that 1% of the respondents to their survey said they paid the ransom but didn't get their data back. And we've seen malicious actors do this. They want to get a piece of the action from these ransomware crimes, but they don't actually have the technical sophistication to run the campaign from end to end. They can penetrate your network, they can encrypt your data, they can deliver a ransomware note, and they can accept your Bitcoin payment, but they don't actually have the ability to manage the cryptographic keys to decrypt your data. And so what they're doing basically is taking your ransom and walking away. And that's awfully tragic, right? You've lost your money. You may now be subject to sanctions or regulatory impacts, and you're still out of luck, and your data is still encrypted. The advice that the U.S. government is giving now to U.S. companies and institutions, which I think is a solid practice, is to make sure that you have backups that are not vulnerable to encryption. And what that means is it's often described as offline backups, but that's not really an accurate way to describe it, I don't think. But the idea is that you've set aside some, some backups that are immutable in the sense that they can't be changed or encrypted. And you have the ability to basically pull those back if you have, any kind of a IT interruption, but certainly if you have a ransomware attack that encrypts your data, and you can basically wipe that server and reload the data and get back to business without paying the ransom, or worse, paying the ransom and still not getting your data back. The criminals are evolving and adapting to this. The fact that U.S. companies in general are doing a better job of backing up their data and therefore are not as vulnerable to these attacks. In the Sophos example, if only 26% paid the ransom, that suggests to me that 75% were able to recover their data from backups. The malicious actors are reacting and amping up the threats. And in some cases, what they're doing is actually exfiltrating the data from the company before they encrypt it, so that they have a copy of it. And the threat is not only to leave it encrypted, but also to release your data and embarrass the company by releasing sensitive customer data, releasing medical records, things like that, to further amp up the fear to extract these payments. So the question is, what can we do to stop this cycle? Should we do a better job of enforcing the ban on payments? Should we spread the ban on payments beyond just designated entities? There's a lot of understandable reluctance to do that, because then you're just punishing the victim, right? And you're leaving these companies with a terrible dilemma to either go out of business, or pay the ransom. Probably the more encouraging trend I mentioned earlier is basically using U.S. government tools like the Cyber Command, like the Department of Justice, to go after these threat actors and where possible, steal the money back. The Bitcoin, the Ethereum, whatever whatever the e-currency they're using for these campaigns, it has to be stored in wallets and other devices. And so if the ransomware actors are not careful, there's the opportunity to steal it back. Another interesting idea that was suggested by Chris Painter, the former U.S. State Department cyber coordinator, suggested setting up a victims fund, which I think is an intriguing idea. in cases where the company doesn't have a backup available to recover, using this fund to help them deal with the economic impacts of not paying the ransom. I'm not sure that's the complete solution to the problem. In some cases, you could imagine a company would go out of business, and if you're talking about, a multi-billion-dollar corporation, that's a lot of money, if there's a couple of claims on that fund at that scale. So I'll just conclude now, and maybe we'll open it up to your questions. But I would say that it's quite staggering the pace of innovation that we've seen from these ransomware crews, and it's to me a clear indication of the money they're making, and that's the economic motive that is driving these folks to keep innovating, to find ways to get into our networks, to crypt this data, to amp up the scare tactics. And so it's tragic. I wish these folks had bent their talents to more productive and less destructive means, but that's life in the modern world, especially for folks in places like Russia or Iran. They might not have other economic opportunities, and that's what drives them to these ends. But I won't spend too much time today talking about the tactics they use to get in. We could probably spend an entire conference talking about those. But they're not unique to ransomware. They're using the same malicious tactics that other cyber criminals use to get into networks. Certainly, my company, other companies are watching carefully what the actors are doing and making sure that we're not vulnerable to these attacks. And we're also working very hard to make sure that we have, backups available that can't be encrypted by these malicious actors. I alluded to earlier, but the malicious actors know that backups will, if they're available, will discourage their victims from paying, and so they hunt on the network for those backups and try to encrypt those too. And so the challenge is to configure your network in a way that those backups can't be encrypted. I said earlier that offline backups to me is a bit of a misnomer. If you're in a complicated enterprise, you need to be backing up your data on a regular basis, and that requires a connection between your production environment and those backups. And so to say that offline or disconnected backups is the solution is to me not very helpful in that you need to be making regular connections to that backup to back up your data. And so the answer is, and I won't go into too much detail about it here today, but the answer to that is what's called an immutable backup, that it can't be encrypted or changed by anyone, including yourself. It can only be deleted. And so then the controls have to be to make sure that the malicious actors can't delete those backups. I think those are all the big points I want to hit today. Maybe we can open it up now to questions.
Okay, all right. So thank you very much, Tom, for this awesome presentations. And so what we're going to do is that we're going to open up the forum for interaction with the audience here. If you have questions, and please continue to submit in the Q&A. I'm going to turn over to our colleague, Crystal. She's going to facilitate the Q&A here.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Tom, for a great presentation. So the first question we have is, can you buy ransomware insurance, and should you buy ransomware insurance if that's a thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I don't work on the business side of insurance. I defend our company's internal networks, and I have to stress again that I'm not speaking for my current employer. But certainly, if you have to come up with $13 million, for example, to pay a ransom, and you have been paying your premiums for a cyber insurance, and your policy includes ransomware payments, then I would say yes. That's something good to have. If that tragic event happens to you. There's been discussion, back to the economics of this, in terms of discouraging payments is should insurance companies not basically include that in the policies? Should they exclude that from the policies, the ransomware payments? And that's a policy question I've seen banging around.
Awesome, thank you. This next one's just like a big paragraph, so just bear with me while I read the whole thing. It says, in the area of privacy, do you believe that products like Amazon Sidewalk should be permitted or made to be illegal? And then I don't know if you know what Amazon Sidewalk is, but it says
I
Sidewalk.
do, yeah.
Okay, perfect. And then they said the big issue among anyone using or wearing an Amazon or Apple device. They're just curious to know kind of the product.
Yeah, it's a bit off topic, but you know, it's a fascinating topic that we could probably spend again a whole conference talking about. But for those of you not familiar with it, Amazon Sidewalk, if you've got an Alexa device, it basically shares your internet connection with your neighbors, and you know, it's an interesting concept, the idea that basically making an internet connection, you know, through Wi-Fi ubiquitous, and so that you're never sort of hunting for a connection no matter where you are. And it makes it easier for, you know, sort of IoT devices. But as the questioner suggests, it's a fraught question. You know, many folks might not understand that your devices are sharing your internet with your neighbors if you don't look carefully at the disclaimers and the settings on your device. And it certainly also has privacy and security implications if Amazon and other sort of providers that have these services haven't carefully secured those connections.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that.
Sure.
Next we have, can a company be liable if a customer's data is compromised, even if they prove they have all the right tools in place and processes?
Yeah. Again, very complicated question, but also a very good question. That doesn't mean it's not a good question. And so, you know, the liability questions and regulatory questions often come down to, you know, what state or country where the company is headquartered or where the customer is. And so there's no simple answer to that question. But the state of Utah recently put out a change to their cyber law as just one example of how complicated this is. And they laid out what they called an affirmative defense for a cyber claim. So if a customer is suing a company saying, "Hey, my data showed up on the internet," you know, basically I want damages for that, right? And so it's often difficult for the victims to show the damage. You know, you're not happy that your social security number or your credit card number or your date of birth was exposed by an attack. But unless it resulted in some kind of, you know, fraud against your bank, most folks, while it's not good and it could result in economic losses, it's hard to actually quantify that loss. And so the state of Utah laid out what is called an affirmative defense for these claims, and saying that if you follow these requirements, if you follow the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, if you do other things, that gives you a defense against these claims. And so that's just one voice in this really complicated conversation. You know, many states, like the state of New York, have much more specific guidance about things that are required of, say, financial providers or insurance companies. And so I would say the bar is rising now for what's required of companies. And so there's that pressure on the regulatory side. There's the pressure that comes from the threat of civil litigation. But over here is the existential threat of a cyber attack. While certainly, like, you know, companies like my employer, we're very careful to study the regulatory requirements and comply with those requirements. But we're also very worried about getting crushed by a cyber attack. And so, you know, we have both those pressures driving us to do everything we can to make sure that all of our systems are patched, that we have all the right cyber tools in place, that our databases are secure, and all of those things. There's just a few examples to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect our customers and their data.
Yes, absolutely. That's great information. This next question is based off of kind of what you were talking about a little bit earlier, and it says, surely the companies, hospitals, they must have backups for all their data. Why can't they just give a command to restore the backup from 2 to 5 days prior to the attack? Isn't it better to lose 2 to 5 days worth of data than to lose all your data and then the ransom money and then possibly face sanctions from the Treasury?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, you know, it's a very complicated question because these network enterprises are so complicated. But, you know, the first thing these big game ransomware hunters do is hunt for the backups and encrypt those too. And so if they're able to do that, you're out of luck. That backup is now encrypted too and is effectively useless. And so certainly I would agree that recovering from 2 or 3 days ago is preferable to paying the ransom. But I would say in some companies, 2 to 3 days is a really long time. A lot of payments went through in that time. A lot of customer data changed. And so it's not a simple question of just going back 3 or 5 days. But I would say that most companies would take that hit and use that old data rather than pay the ransom if possible. But if they've encrypted your backups, you're out of luck. And then there's the question of, do you pay the ransom or just take the economic hit of rebuilding your network?
Great point. And kind of on the topic of backups, obviously, we have backups are great, but how can companies prevent the infiltration in the first place? How are they preventing the security firewalls, penetrating the security firewalls? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, again, we could probably spend 2 conferences talking about that topic, but there is I would say, a basic standard of care that companies need to follow. And there's lots of great frameworks out there that can guide that. But the one most companies in the US are now following is a framework put out by the US Department of Commerce's National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. And it's called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And it's a great framework for sort of charting where you are today and where you need to get to in terms of your cybersecurity, the tools and processes and practices you need to build out to defend your network. There's also regulatory guidance from states, or if you're a critical infrastructure provider like a pipeline, or that there's also guidance from your federal regulators that sort of give you some minimum requirements you have to meet to defend your network. And then there's also lots of other forums that the U.S. companies talk in, the banks, the healthcare providers. They're called ISACs, Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. And these are safe places where we can all talk and trade best practices and talk about threats and say, hey, I saw this hit my network yesterday. Here's how they tried to come in. Here's a sample of the malware. So we're all talking and sharing information to make sure that we're keeping up with the threat, because it doesn't stand still. They're constantly innovating. They're constantly sort of looking for new holes in our network. The major software providers, Microsoft, Adobe, they put out regular updates for their software that require patches to be applied to fill those gaps. And that's because they're testing their own products. They're allowing outside researchers to test their products. There are third parties like Google Project Zero that are testing their products. And once those vulnerabilities are found, they're basically releasing patches to close those holes in their products. The problem is that the bad guys can see the patch too, and so they get to work the minute it's released, reverse engineering it, trying to figure out what it is what hole that Microsoft is trying to fill with that patch. And if they can find it and then basically start putting out an exploit in malware to grab that hole, they might actually beat a company to the punch in terms of the patch. So if a company, say it takes a company 15 days to do the testing and deploy a patch, if the malicious actors can basically reverse engineer the patch, figure out what the exploit is, and deploy that in malware in 7 days, you may have a problem. And so that's why it's so important to patch fast for us. But what I'm saying in a very long-winded way is that it's a lot of work, and there's a lot of vectors you have to watch and defend against for these attacks. And it's not staying still. They're constantly innovating and looking for ways to get around this. Maybe cat and mouse game is one way to describe it. We deploy a defense, and then the bad guys immediately go to work trying to find a way around it. And so, one other important way to think about this is having redundancy and multiple layers of defense. And so that if an attacker is able to defeat one of your controls, there's 7 or 8 more controls they have to get through to get to your data and get out.
Absolutely. So this next question says, the conversation has mostly been in context of the economic crime, but it's easy to see how these techniques would be highly destructive in a national state warfare. Can you speak to the national security risk of ransomware?
Yeah, absolutely. I think another good example to talk about is NotPetya and some of the Russian attacks that have went out. And so the U.S. global shipping company Maersk was hit by a ransomware attack that was actually directed against the Ukrainian economy. And it's widely believed by researchers that this was actually Russian intelligence trying to disrupt the Russian economy and we could talk all day about why the Russians want to disrupt the Ukrainian economy, but we'll set that aside for now. But the ransomware got loose and it attacked lots of other companies that were not doing business in Ukraine. And so that it basically attacked Maersk globally and deleted most of their enterprise systems at the global level. And so here's a case where a nation state was doing a destructive attack. It was sort of masquerading as a ransomware attack when it was actually just destructive malware that just deleted the data. And so you can see clearly how it's already being used by nation states to achieve their national goals. And you could imagine that in a larger conflict, between the U.S. and another major nation state, they might not be able to compete with us militarily, right? They don't have aircraft carriers necessarily or bombers, but they do have 15 guys in the basement with laptops, and would they try and attack us virtually by attacking a power provider or a pipeline provider to try and cause damage to the U.S. economy? And that's certainly something that we're very concerned about. And the NIST Cybersecurity Framework was actually originally designed just for U.S. Critical infrastructure providers. And the idea was to harden those companies so that they could defend themselves in the event of a nation state attack that would impact U.S. citizens because that critical service was denied to them. And so it's something that the U.S. government is very concerned about. And it's something that U.S. companies and critical infrastructures are very concerned about. And it's a threat that they're very aware of. When we saw the U.S. Department of Justice set up that task force, and they also, there have been reports that the Department of Justice is now treating cybercrime with the same tools they use to go after terrorism. And so that's a reflection of the fact that while this crime is terrible and it is impacting the U.S. economy and U.S. citizens, a threat actor operating from a place like Russia attacking a U.S. critical infrastructure provider is a national security threat. And so they're responding appropriately with the right tools. And that's why you saw the U.S. government basically go after the dark side. That was the name of the threat actor that attacked the Colonial Pipeline. Go after the dark side actors and basically steal the Bitcoin back. And there's also reports that they basically damaged and shut down the dark side's sort of computer infrastructure. And so that's a clear recognition that this is a national security threat, and we're using national security tools to deal with it.
Thank you for that. The next question is, should companies hire third parties to help get the data back, or can DOJ/the Treasury help instead?
Yeah, again, there's no easy answer to this. If the Department of Justice probably doesn't have the means to defend every company that gets attacked and to basically chase down the Bitcoin for those companies. And so the question is, and is there then a place for a U.S. cyber defense company to hack back, to go out and do what the Department of Justice did in the case of the Colonial Pipeline and go out and find a Bitcoin wallet and basically take that money back? And that is a very legally complicated question because the Bitcoin wallet that you're attacking might have Bitcoin in it for people that are not cyber criminals. And so could you inadvertently steal or delete their e-currency? Well, now basically that company has committed a crime, right? They've some maybe even a U.S. citizen basically put their Bitcoin in that wallet that the dark side was also using. If the Department of Justice goes in there, to me, I guess I feel more comfortable with them making those decisions and basically stealing that Bitcoin. I'm much less comfortable with a private sector company doing these things. The hackback argument has also been used to say that, in the cases where they're either just stealing data or a ransomware actor is also exfiltrating data to amp up the fear and extract a payment, should a U.S. cyber company basically go find that server and delete that data or bring that data back? And again, you're left with really complicated legal and moral questions, what is that server? Is it a server that, this malicious actor is just compromised and is hijacking for their purposes? And, could this be, a hospital server? And if you go in there and delete the data on it, are you basically deleting patient records and causing a medical crisis, somewhere else in the world? So I would say that there are no easy answers to these questions. And the hackback question comes up quite often in US policy debates. And there are definitely a lot of loud voices out there saying that the US government doesn't have the means to defend everybody. And so we need to basically deputize or give licenses to US cyber defense companies to allow them to hack back. And, then maybe people talk about possibly, providing guidelines or, boundaries or regulations that will allow these companies to do certain things, but not others. But this is certainly not a settled debate.
Yes, I feel like this conversation could go on for hours. This next question is, if most of these attacks start from outdated software and phishing emails, shouldn't more responsibility be put on the company? If companies are required to carry high-cost insurance policies for these types of events, then perhaps the board of these companies will be more willing to cover the cost of IT and security.
Yeah, and, I'll circle back to what I said earlier about the different pressures that U.S. companies face. And so, certainly there are a lot of regulatory and legal requirements for companies to defend their customers' data. For example, the California Consumer Privacy Act, the European GDPR. There's already a lot of pressure on companies, not uniform and not complete, but I would say there's a lot of pressure on companies, especially in certain sectors, to apply a minimum standard of care to their data. But the pressure on the other side of malicious actors coming at us is much, much greater. And so for a company right now to not, sort of apply that minimum standard of care is madness, because the attacks are so frequent and so prolific right now. And so I'd say there's already quite a bit of pressure on companies. They still make mistakes though, right? They still, we have this sort of like, this facepalm, reports where you find out, why a company got hit and, the mistakes they made to basically allow that attack. And so certainly I think you're going to see less and less of that, because companies are being, sort of tested by this fire every day now. And to leave your customer data exposed, it's probably not going to be long before one of these ransomware crews finds it and exploits it. But the very long answer to the question, to sum it up, I would say yes, there is an absolute obligation on these companies to defend their customers' data and protect it. And so the question is, what happens when they fail to do everything they should have done to defend that data? Part of the problem is it's complicated, right? They want to do everything right, but they don't necessarily have the right team in place or the right resources. And cybersecurity talent is awfully scarce these days and in demand, and so it's awfully hard sometimes to find the right people, and especially for a small company that doesn't have a lot of revenue, to defend that data and do the right things, even if they aspire to do it. And so, I'd say it's getting a little easier in the sense that there are better tools out there. The software is getting more secure. Basically the IT providers are doing a better job of testing and opening their software to outside researchers for testing. But the obligation remains on that company to do all the right things and defend their customers' data.
Excellent. So the next question we have is, in a medical/research setting, are there any other implications of exploitations of genetic personal information we should be aware of at the top? We should be aware of and on top of making the data holder pay for their data?
I'm not sure I understand the question. And I have to stress that I'm not an expert on sort of the biomedical industry. But, one thing I think that folks do worry about is, I can say is that people worry about, biometrics being compromised. The thumbprint scan on your phone, that if that gets out in the wild, you can't change your thumbprint. And so, people worry about, basically a cell phone provider not doing a good job of protecting the hash of that scan, but I'm afraid I can't go too deep on biomedical stuff because I'm not an expert on that.
Well, thank you for taking a stab at that. This next question might be a stab at question for you as well, but it says, will you make an estimate of the percentage of ransom victims who are actually following the best practices at the time of their ransom attack?
No. No, I'm sorry, I'm being facetious, but I would refer you back to what I said earlier in this, is that we just don't have good data. A lot of companies are discouraged from talking about what happens to them because they're concerned about their corporate reputation. They're concerned about, regulatory or impacts, or, getting sued by their customers. And so they hide, and they don't talk about what happens to them. And so there has been discussion. The Cyber Solarium is a task force that came up with recommendations for improving our cybersecurity in the U.S. And one of the things they talked about was some kind of and I'm probably not getting it quite right, so apologies if I don't cast this recommendation exactly as they said it, but basically a data collection operation in the federal government where you can share your data with the government anonymously, and so we can collect statistics, and maybe even put a legal obligation behind it that you have to report, a cyber incident to this, sort of cyber statistics bureau, within a certain amount of time after an attack, and that would help us chart what's going on and help guide U.S. Sort of law enforcement activities. It would help guide cybersecurity providers on what tools and things they need to be doing. But that's a proposal, right? And where we stand now is there isn't good data. It's getting better, I think, marginally. I think some companies feel more comfortable talking about what happened to them. They also may be obligated for regulatory reasons to talk about what happened to them. And so I see more data today than I did, 5-10 years ago about cyber attacks. But we're not in a good place where we have good visibility into this. There are confidential forums, like I mentioned earlier, those ISACs, where companies can talk with their industry peers and share best practices and share things that happen to them. But even those conversations sometimes can be very constrained because of those fears of civil litigation or legal or regulatory impacts.
Great, thank you. Maybe we'll be able to fit in 2 more questions, but we are getting closer to noon and I just want to be cautious of time. So another question we have is, I know this is more for corporations, but is there a risk to individuals being targeted with these attacks, and how can we protect ourselves?
Yeah, I would just refer back to what I said earlier about, having a good framework for your cybersecurity program. I would recommend the NIST Cybersecurity Framework as a good start. That is a good end-to-end framework for understanding where you are and where you need to go. And it lays out the full range of tools and cyber practices that, you need to have in place for that minimum standard of care for your customers and your data. It's not easy. It's really complicated. And there's just no way around that. It's one thing if you've just got one laptop, an internet connection, but as your company gets bigger and bigger, we call it the attack surface, is basically that piece of your company that's exposed, of your network that's exposed to attack, grows. As you have employees logging in from home with VPN, as you have relationships with other companies that you need to share data with, the complexity that goes up exponentially, and the things you need to do to protect those data connections and to not allow gaps that a malicious actor get really difficult. And there isn't really a good answer for how you deal with that. But I would say the process starts with a good cybersecurity framework like NIST CSF, I think.
Great. Okay, let's do one more question. And it'll say, if customers' sensitive data is encrypted, is there a possibility that attackers or insiders can decrypt it? Are layers of encryption now required?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in some cases, we've seen a cybersecurity company or the federal government gets a hold of the key that a ransomware crew is using, and they're not changing their keys. they can actually give that to a company and help them decrypt their data. There's also tools sometimes for ransomware that's maybe not that sophisticated, where you can actually put a tool on your network that will actually defend that device from being encrypted. So there are things you can do to try and defeat these attacks. But I would say the best defense is to have a secure network, to not allow them in, and not allow them to encrypt your data. And then, of course, and if that fails, to have good immutable backups that you can use to recover your data.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, for taking the time to answer all these questions. And I just posted in the chat, I wanted to say thank you to everyone who has submitted questions, and sorry we could not get to all of them. They're all great questions, but I'm going to pass it back over to Bruce.
Yeah, and just thanks for your time, folks. Great questions. I really appreciate your time, and it's an honor to speak to you today. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Tom, and thanks for this terrific sessions and this great Q&A interaction here. So just want to remind everyone that we have 2 more sessions today. One is going to be at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and then the other one is 3 p.m. Eastern Time. At 1 p.m., we will have a presentation from Heather Hinton, and she is the Chief Information Security Officer for RingCentral, which is a publicly traded company that offers the communications platforms. And then at 3 p.m., we will have Model Risk Management by Hakan Gaktas, and Hakan is the global head of model risk at American Express. So thank you very much, and we will see you in the afternoon at 1 p.m.